All right, everyone. So let's talk today about um, anti-Semitism, specifically vis-a-vis Israel. Um, we've had a sort of a history lesson. We've talked about um, we've talked about the Middle Ages. We've talked about racial anti-Semitism. We've talked about sort of how even in the modern day, from the right and from the left, they use some of the traditional anti-Semitic tropes in the way that they speak about Jews. But specifically today, I want to focus on Israel and on whether or not we can say that that is anti-Semitism. So the question that we want to ask is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism, right? Meaning I am against the Zionistic ideology. Is that being against Jews? More specifically, can one be against Israel and not be anti-Semitic? And if the answer to that is yes, what does it look like? And then more specifically, how do we know when that line has been crossed? That's really sort of what I want to talk about today. Okay? If we're going to answer this question, then we need to actually take some time and understand some basics. Because part of the challenge that we have, especially for people who are not educated about their own tradition, Judaism or Zionism, is Zionism is being defined by the people who oppose it, and then they say, I oppose that. So I think it's important to actually have a conversation of, what does BDS, boycott, divest, sanction, which we'll talk about, mean when they say, I'm against Zionism? And what do I mean? And I'll give you a completely different basis for this, right? I've had people come into my office over the years and say, Rabbi, I don't believe in God. Okay, right? Let's talk. So we start to have a conversation. I'm like, so tell me about this God that you don't believe in. And they start to describe, well, I don't believe that God can do this, should do this, and I don't believe God is that, and I don't believe God is that. And by the end of the conversation, I say, well, I don't believe in that God either. Let me tell you the God that, when I say God, let me tell you what I mean by that. And then once we define our terms now, and we both understand this is what we're talking about, now we can have a discussion of whether we agree or disagree on that particular issue. So our question that we're going to spend probably about half of our class today is, what is Zionism? Because without knowing that, there's no way that we can tell whether or not somebody is being anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, and be able to answer this question. Zionism was coined, the term Zionism was originally coined in 1890 by Nathan Birnbaum. And he coined it and understood it as the national movement for the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and the resumption of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. That's our starting point. So let's actually unpack this a little bit. National movement. Well, nationalism didn't really come onto the scene until the 1800s. So this is about right. We were a little bit late, right? The French, the English, most of Europe was nationalized, right, before we got that concept. But we also said, well, we're a people. We have a national identity. And that idea of nationalism became part of who we are. Jewish nationalism is called Zionism as step one. And then it focuses on the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and the resumption of Jewish sovereignty. Now, this is basing it on a history that actually those people who oppose Israel are going to say, well, Jews were never there. It was never Jewish land. So return of Jewish people to their homeland, right? They look at 1948 and say, well, that's when Israel started. That's when, Judaism started, forgetting the fact that our Torah talks about Israel and being in the land of Israel, that the first temple was there, the second temple was there, King David, King Saul, King Solomon, all of those people were there, that we had Jewish autonomy all the way through the year 70 when the Romans came and conquered and kicked us out. That is the history that we are understanding. We have been in diaspora, in exile, since 70. Now, there have always been Jews living there. There was never a time that there weren't Jews living in the land of Israel. And usually very often it was a small group of them. But there were always Jews that were living in the land of Israel, even during the Roman, the Ottoman, all of those different times. Now, in the more modern times, since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, it has taken on another meaning, which is to include the movement for the development of Israel and the protection of the Jewish nation. And that, by the way, is the only definition that those who oppose Zionism actually think about. They ignore the first part and only focus on the second part. It's not so simple to define. And one of the things that we are going to see is there are actually different types of Zionisms. And we're gonna see that today. Nana's asking, how do we define nation in this context? Well, it's not easy to define that either, but nationalism is a modern ideology that said that that people who live in the same area, who have the same common sort of goals and interests, can come together as one nation under one sovereignty. No, it doesn't matter their race necessarily, doesn't matter their religion necessarily. So if you're living in France, you're French. If you're living in England, you're British. That's the way that nationalism very often is defined. To define a nation, that's a lot more difficult and a little out of the scope, I think, for today. So there are multiple philosophies and multiple areas of focus that Zionism brings, and it depends on the location of where the Zionism originated and what the ideology of the people was. So Zionism that started in the United States is going to look different than the Zionism that started in Russia, which is going to look different than the Zionism that is being fostered in South America, potentially. But all Zionistic philosophies have three ideas in common. One, Ahavat Zion, a love of Zion. Zion, let's talk about that. What is Zion? Zion is Jerusalem. It is how Jerusalem was referred to in the Bible. It's actually specifically a mountain in Jerusalem, which is still there. You can still see where it is, to the south and to the west a little bit of the Temple Mount, where the temple was. And it's where Zion Gate is coming in to the old city. So that's Zion. So a love of Zion, this religious, philosophical belief that we have a connection there, and that we have that passionate connection and that love. Two, it's a nationalistic ideology that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination, to have a place that they can call their own, just like French people do and other people do. And it's a way to cope and combat anti-Semitism, or at least it started as a result of anti-Semitism. We're going to get to this at the end, but the whole purpose of going to Israel, of bringing everybody there, of starting the state of Israel, was actually to combat anti-Semitism, because Jews were unprotected and were being killed throughout the world. And so this was a way to deal with that. There are lots of different flavors of Zionism. Political Zionism, socialist, labor Zionism, religious Zionism, American Zionism. We're going to talk very, very briefly about them. I could give a course just on Zionism, which this is not. I'm trying to do this all within only the first half of our class today. But it's important that we understand that these are different ideologies and coming from different perspectives. Theodor Herzl, who is known as the father and founder of Zionism, was a Paris correspondent for a Vienna newspaper. And in 1894, he covered the Dreyfus trial. What is the Dreyfus trial? The Dreyfus trial was a French officer who was being accused of treason, and everybody sort of knew that it was because of anti-Semitism. He was a Jew, and there wasn't really a case that was a reasonable case, and yet he was still convicted and he was still executed because he was a Jew. And that caused him to try and find a solution to what he called the Jewish question. In 1896, he wrote a book called The Jewish State. And he believed that if all the Jews came together and lived in one place, there wouldn't be any more anti-Semitism. The reason anti-Semitism existed, according to the way he thought, was because we were underfoot, so to speak, right? We were living in Russia and we were living in all these different places, but if we just lived by ourselves, it'd be fine. Everybody would leave us alone. Didn't turn out to be true, but that was his belief. And while the land of Israel made sense to him, he wasn't tied to it, right? He argued the land of Israel made sense because of our historical attachment to it, but for his purposes, Argentina, Uganda, there were areas there that were considered. He was sort of the founder of what we call political Zionism, because for him, it's about having the autonomy to protect yourself. That's it. That's it. And that was his most important goal. Spiritual Zionism comes at it from a different perspective. Its founder was a man by the name of Asher Ginsburg, who is also known as Echad Ha'am. And the foundational or fun pillar of spiritual Zionism is that Zion, Jerusalem, is the spiritual center for all of Judaism. The land of Israel is our spiritual center. That is where our stories take place. That is where our origin stories take place. That is who we are. And he was really concerned with maintaining the culture and tradition of Judaism against assimilation. That was his reason for being Zionistic, not because of the political ramifications that Theodor Herzl had, but because Jews were at risk of losing their spiritual core. And the place to find that is in Zion, in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. For those who came from Russia, a lot of them brought socialism with them. And so Ber Barachov founded what we know as socialist ideology or socialist Zionism. And they saw Jew as the proletariat. They were following the ideas of the Marxist revolution and socialism in the Soviet Union. And he wanted to find a place that Jews could do that too, because unfortunately, the pogroms in Russia made it unsafe for Jews to be there. So he wanted to bring this Soviet socialist idea of how to live to a place where the Jews could be safe. So he looked for a place that had no economic structure. It had a very nomadic population. It was overall an undesirable area, and it had to already have some Jews there. And the land of Israel was the perfect place. It met all of those categories in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Labor Zionism, many of us know the kibbutz movement, and many of the early kibbutzim came out of the idea of labor Zionism, right? That working the land is the only authentic way to live. Labor Zionism was kind of a push against the Industrial Revolution. And that, we had to get away from all this, infernal machinery and all of this stuff and go back to working the land. That's how we're going to be authentic people and authentic Jews. So A.D. Gordon was a proponent of this. And he didn't feel like he could do that in Europe because of the Industrial Revolution. So he needed a place that was not developed. And the land of Israel was the perfect place for that. Because again, at that time, it was a very undesirable place. Religious Zionism, the founder was Rabbi Abraham Kook. It's similar to spiritual Zionism, but he really focused on it as living in the land of Israel increased our religious connection as a Jew. Not just our spiritual connection, but our observance, our religious connection. Living in the land was more holy than anywhere else. And it was God's given land to the Jewish people. And therefore, we need to go back to our land. What's interesting is from his perspective, there was no need for a political state at all. We just needed to be on the land. He didn't care who was ruling it, who was governing it. Now that's changed in religious Zionism, but at the early time, that was the case. For the last one, and again, I'm just trying to get through these quickly, but I want you to understand that when somebody says, I'm anti-Zionist, well, what are you talking about? What do you mean? It's not so easy to define. There's American Zionist. The founder was Louis Brandeis, head of the Supreme Court. And he actually argued that you don't need to live in Zion to be Zionist. You don't need to live in the land of Israel to be a Zionist. And he was really the founder of American Zionism, of our support for Israel from here, right? All the other Zionists were like, you needed to move to Israel in order to fulfill the Zionistic dream. But Louis Brandeis said no. He actually argued you can have dual loyalties. You can be loyal to the United States and have a loyalty to the land of Israel. So all of this together is Zionism. And when people are speaking about Zionism as being genocidal, as being all of this, right? None of that is here. None of that is part of what it means to be a Zionist. Nothing said that we move to Israel and we get rid of all of the natives that are there. On the contrary, most of them were very ready to live side by side with everybody who was there. It wasn't until 1948 and the War of Independence that we started to get into territorial issues. So, one of the big questions is, can you be anti-Zionistic and be a Jew? And the answer actually is yes. You can even be a very observant Jew. This is a group that is called Niture Karta. They actually go and meet with Iran, and they are anti-Zionistic for one reason and one reason only, and that is they do not believe the state that there should be Jewish sovereignty until the Messiah comes, and they find it the height of hubris that we would be governing ourselves in anywhere and in the land of Israel. That being in the diaspora in their religious worldview is a punishment, and we need to accept our punishment until such time as God is ready to let it to let it end. So we see the Jews, you can be Jewish, you can be religious, and believe that Jews can't have sovereignty until the Messiah comes. You can also be anti-nationalistic, right? By saying that Jews are a religion or a culture and not a people. And if you don't define Jews as a national people, they don't need a national home. They can live anywhere. And there are some Jews who have that ideology. The first two tend to be the more religious Jews, right? Who hold those ideas. There's also a belief that nationalism and states are not the appropriate way for modern world to live. A more global ideology that states are bad, just flat out. Doesn't matter, Jewish state, but America, states are a bad way to live. And so you see that. And it becomes a more broad ideology that then feeds into, well, so the Jews shouldn't have a state either. Okay. So how do we know? Because this is the question that I get asked probably most often, right? How do I know when somebody is just being critical of a government or being anti-Semitic, right? Because we, as living in the liberal world, in a democratic world, we have a right and maybe even an obligation to be critical of governments. So can I be critical of the Israeli government? I mentioned this last week, right? In Israel, being critical of the government is a daily pastime. It's a sport. But how do I know when it's acceptable or when it's not? And the way that we really can understand it came about from Natan Sharansky, who's an Israeli politician. He is the former head of the Jewish Agency, and he is a Soviet refusenik. For those who remember, in the 80s, there was a period of time when Jews wanted to try and get out of the Soviet Union and come to Israel, and they were not allowed out. They were put in jail, and there was this national outcry to release. He was one of the main leaders of that, and finally came to Israel. And he created what's called the 3D test. The 3D test is demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. If what's being said about Israel is a demonization of Israel, that's anti-Semitism. If you're saying Israelis are Nazis, that's anti-Semitism. You're not talking about a policy. If you're saying that the state of Israel shouldn't exist, that's anti-Semitic, because every other people has a right to self-determination. By the way, most Zionists would argue, not all, so do the Palestinian people. We have to do it in a way that is safe and allows for people to live side by side. There are those who don't, but that comes after a history of conflict as opposed to a philosophical piece. And a double standard, right? If I'm holding Israel to a standard that I don't hold any other country to, that's anti-Semitic. So this is the 3D test. And according to the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, right, anti-Israel activity crosses into anti-Semitism when all Jews are held responsible for the actions of Israel. Which D does that fall under? That's demonization, not just of the state of Israel, but of Jews. When Israel is denied the right to exist as a Jewish state or as an equal member to the global community, that's delegitimization. When traditional anti-Semitic symbols or images or theories are used, again, demonization. Deeper bias against Israel is also evident when Israel is held to a different standard than any other country in the world. Such an example, when critics of Israel question or deny Israel's right to exist. No one questions France or China or Iran's right to exist simply because they're in disagreement with their policies. Similarly, questions of motivation arise when Israelis singled out for criticism for actions or policies that nations around the world engage with impunity. So if you are going to argue that I am a human rights warrior, I want to fight for human rights, and you can argue, and I think you can fairly argue in some places, that I am very concerned about the way that Israel treats the Palestinians under certain circumstances. I think that's a fair conversation to have. But then why aren't we having that, you also having that conversation about China or Iran or Saudi Arabia or any of these other places with known human rights violations, and yet that seems to be okay. Not only that, nobody's calling for their demise and destruction. So how do I know when somebody is a true human rights warrior? Then they fight for human rights around the world. And if you want to call some of the practices of Israel into question, okay, let's have that conversation. But if you're not willing to call other countries, but only Israel, then your motivation is not human rights. Your motivation is something else. Let's look at some of these in real life. Many people have heard that, the United Nations has been called an anti-Semitic organization, right? Certainly anti-Israel. Where does that come from, right? Where does that come from? It comes from the way that the United Nations has behaved throughout history, all the way through, especially from the 70s onward. Especially from the 70s onward. 1975, UN General Resolution 3379 determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. And this, by the way, was as a result of a Soviet campaign to counter America during the Cold War. The Soviets brought this forward to decrease America's power and try to alienate Israel, which was the American stronghold in the Middle East during the Cold War, from the Arab countries. This resolution was revoked in 1991 with 111 to 25, 13 abstentions, and the revocation was just very simply a one line. The General Assembly decides to revoke the determination contained as a resolution. They realized with the motivations, they realized that it wasn't accurate, and so it was revoked. Let's talk about proportionality, right? The UN Human Rights Council is there to fight for human rights. From 2006 to 2016, there were more resolutions against Israel for human rights violations than against the entirety of the rest of the world. There were 68 total resolutions against Israel, 67 against the rest of the world. There were 48, 48 nations that had zero condemnation. Nations like Cuba and China and Yemen and Somalia and Venezuela, who we know have human rights violations, but nothing was said about them. And yet, Israel had 68 resolutions, 3 times more than any other single country in the world. So one of two things is possible. Either Israel is the most barbarous country in the world where people are being raped on the street and murdered in their beds. Well, they are. That was just October 7th. Right? Or there's something else going on here. Let's go to 2001. There was a world conference against racism, right? Racism is a problem. Absolutely. Racism is a problem, and we as the world should 100% get together and find ways to fight against racism. 2001 Durban. The purpose of this conference was to present an international united front against racism, xenophobia, and intolerance. What were the actions that came out of this? Israel is an apartheid state. Zionism is racism. Israel is an occupying state. Israel perpetrates war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide. And the Holocaust is not unique. There's many different people that have had similar tragedies. Israel as a Jewish state was born in sin and established through an ethnic cleansing of mandatory Arab Palestine. This is what came out of the conference. Not a single statement about any other type of hatred, any other racism. It was this was what it was about. Again, either Israel is the most sinister country on earth, or there's something else going on here. Boycott, divest, sanction movement, BDS, is actually built on the 3Ds. Their platform is built on delegitimizing Israel, demonizing Israel, and not criticizing anybody else for the same things that they are criticizing Israel for. Let's watch a little video on how to critique Israel without being anti-Semitic.
You may have noticed that when some politicians or prominent figures critique Israel, a messy conversation ensues over whether or not they're being anti-Semitic.
A freshman lawmaker is taking heat for remarks that critics are calling anti-Semitic.
Those comments caused hurt.
They should remove her from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I feel confident that her
words are not based on any anti-Semitic attitude.
Well, there's plenty of anti-Semitism going around these days. Not all critiques of Israel are rooted in a hatred for Jews. Indeed, it is entirely possible to critique Israel and its policies without being anti-Semitic. Here's how. 1. Avoid anti-Semitic tropes. At its core, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory that Jews wield a disproportionate power and influence over the world, and therefore they are evil. When people are critiquing Israel, listen to see if they are using language that includes anti-Semitic tropes like that Jews are greedy or power hungry, or that Jews have hypnotized the media, or that Jews use money to get their way.
The problem is that you have to still be sensitive to the fact that there are ancient anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have been used in the service of like mass murder.
Sure.
That say that Jews try to manipulate world events with their money and aren't really
Sorry.
loyal to the countries in which they live.
2. Don't conflate all Jews with the Israeli government. Just as no one would assume all Americans support and agree with the current administration, critiques of Israel should stick to the policies at play and not assume that all Jews or all Israelis agree with the choices of the Israeli government.
You could be against the current Israeli administration, as I am,
Mhm.
like Benjamin Netanyahu, and still call out anti-Semitism against Jews in the
Sure.
United States, for example.
3. Stick to critiquing Israel's policies. There's also a difference between critiquing a specific Israeli policy and demonizing the existence of any Jewish state in principle. The latter can quickly veer into anti-Semitism.
You want to criticize a particular policy? That's fine. When you demonize the country that is the only Jewish country in the world, the country where half of the world's Jews live, you're engaging in anti-Semitism.
You say you're anti-Zionist, well, what you're really saying is you're against the existence of the state of Israel. If you don't want Israel to exist, that is clearly anti-Semitic.
Keep in mind, this is an incredibly complicated topic with many gray areas. As you can imagine, not even all Jews agree on what is and isn't anti-Semitic.
Okay. So clearly, I brought that, which is a very left-oriented video, right? In terms of bringing together, trying to have a conversation. There were flags, there were Palestinian flags and Israeli flags next to each other up there. It comes from a group that is really trying to create dialogue. And they actually did a good job of laying out what the pitfalls are. You want to have dialogue? Let's have dialogue, right? You want to argue about history? Fine, let's argue about history, right? Don't say that the Jews are trying to kill everybody. Don't say that the Jews are perpetrating a genocide. Don't say, right? Let's argue. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what it means to have, people removed from their homes and why that happened. And okay, fine. But let's have the conversation. Not every conversation is easy. But when you say the state of Israel doesn't have a right to exist, the state of Israel shouldn't be there, the state of Israel was built on a system of a removal of everybody else, that actually is not accurate. That happened because the Arab world in 1948 didn't accept a two-state solution where Jews and Arabs could live side by side. Nobody was removed from their homes until the war. Until the war. And that's when history changed. So let's have that conversation. I had the opportunity, I added this last piece in, I had the opportunity on Sunday, this last Sunday, to be part of an anti-Semitism symposium here in San Diego. There were about 300 of us there, and we got to listen to Abe Foxman, and he's incredible. This is an older picture. He's 83 years old and still very, very eloquent and a potent speaker. He is the former director of the ADL, and he was the director from 87 to 2015. And he said a couple of things on Sunday which really stood out to me, and I had never really thought about it in this way. Number one, he talked about the fact that the Zionist movement was created to make Jews normal. In other words, everybody was creating that sense of national identity and that place where they could go and they could be. And And Zionism was meant to just be just like everyone else, not to be different, not to be superior, not to be whatever, but to be just like everyone else, to solve the problem. And he said something also, which I found I'd never heard this way, and it was really quite powerful. He said Israel had become the Jew of the international community. It's being ostracized the way that Jews have been ostracized in the past. So it used to be, in the Middle Ages, that the Jew was ostracized and demonized and delegitimized and sent aside, right? And now we don't do that to the individual Jew. Instead, the international community is doing that to Israel. But the pattern is the same. The pattern is still there. It just globalized as opposed to staying really individual or communal. So, can one be against Israel and not anti-Semitic? Yes, absolutely. What does that look like? Avoid the 3Ds, right? Demonization, delegitimization, double standards. And don't treat Israel like the Jew of the Middle Ages, right? Trying to ostracize and set outside. When we see those things, it's not an anti-Israel position, it's an anti-Semitic position. All right, I left some time for conversations. Next week, it will be the last session. We'll talk about what can we do. So I won't answer any questions on the what can we do side of things, but I'm happy to entertain questions on Israel and wherever we want to go with that today. Nan.
So I asked you last week and you said, wait until this week. Talk to us about occupation.
Yeah. So occupation is a state where there is a disjunction in government, right? It usually comes after a war, where government, where that area isn't being brought in and run the way that the rest of the nation is, but it's still being run by that outside government, right? And we see it all over the world after a war, you know, and Israel, there's no doubt that Israel is on land and is occupying land that was set aside for a Palestinian state by the UN partition in 1947, right? Occupation is basically, when people say there's an occupation, they go back to, we go back to the Green Line, 1947. Anything that's over there, Israel shouldn't be there. By the way, that's half of Jerusalem, right? We're not just talking about areas in the West Bank. It's half of Jerusalem. It's other places. The issue with is, when do we use that term, right? Palestinians are using the term occupation because it's anything that is over the 1947 agreement. The problem is there was no 1947 agreement. The Arabs didn't agree to it. And so it was after the war that we said, okay, this is what it's going to be. That's when the initial claim of occupation started. The second claim of occupation, and I think most Israelis would actually agree to it, is to say, by the time we got to the 67 war, it was already war number 3, right? We had the War of Independence, we had the Sinai Campaign in 1956, and now we're at 1967. It was war number 3. And Israel said, enough of this. So Israel won, and they conquered a lot of territory, and they said, we're not just going to give it back at the end. We're going to keep it until you make peace with us. So is that land occupied? Yeah, I guess technically it is. Right? However, that occupied land was given back to Egypt when Egypt signed peace. Right? Much of that occupied land was offered to Jordan. Jordan didn't want it. Much of that occupied land was offered to Arafat and to other people in the Oslo Accords and things like that in order to make peace. The reality is, with the exception of the settlers, and I am not a settler, that is not my mentality, right? I do not believe that just because something was mentioned in the Bible, it has to be under Jewish, what's the word I want? Not
Purview.
dominion, but
Purview.
yeah, hegemony, right? So where Israel is waiting, and has been until recently, for peace to be able to give that occupied land back. So the word occupied doesn't bother me. Israel doesn't want it. By the way, Gaza is no longer, well, now it may be because there's Israeli troops there, but until October 7th or 8th, right? Gaza was no longer occupied because in 2005, all Jews were out of it. So to call Gaza occupied territory actually doesn't work anymore, except for today. Now we're back there. So does that sort of answer the question? I know I kind of danced around it a little bit, but was there a particular question that you wanted to lead into on that, Nan?
No, I think that, when you hear occupation, I think most people who use that term don't really know what they're referring to. It's like, where is this occupation happening? It's exactly what you said. Israel left Gaza in 2005 or 2007, right? And yet people talk about Gaza as if it were occupied. Like, no, Israel left. It's not an occupied area.
Well, let me actually, so I'll actually take it a step further. The people who are chanting from the river to the sea are actually claiming that from the river to the sea is occupied.
Mhm. Mhm.
So depending on who you're talking to, right? From the river to the sea is a genocidal statement to get rid of Israel, to get rid of the Jews. It's anti-Semitic. There's not a lot of conversation to have with that. I was actually trying to take a step back from that and actually say, okay, there are disputed territories. I believe that. I don't believe that we should be creating all these settlements, right? In areas that, if we had a partner to negotiate with, would go to the Palestinians as a Palestinian state. Because we're just going to have to do what we did in 2005 and try to schlep all these people out of there. Right? So I do believe that there are territories that are technically being occupied, but they're being occupied because there's no partner for peace. And to give them back would be a serious security risk.
Okay, that makes sense.
Barb.
Kind of going back to the double standard, I'm thinking of the rights of women in the Middle East, in the Arab countries. And when they talk about Palestinian rights, I'm wondering what those are and if those would extend to basically half the population and all the countries surrounding it, which is the women. Because if they want, the right to vote and to own land and to have sovereignty, I'm wondering what their list is and why that wouldn't extend again to the entire population of the region.
Right. Look, there is a big difference between Palestinian Arabs that are living in the land of in the state of Israel and in the West Bank and then in Gaza, right? Gaza is chaos. It is run by Hamas. It is its own enclave, and the only thing that Israel could do when they took over and started firing missiles was to try to seal it off and keep them from coming across like they did on October 7th, right? But the West Bank is dealt with very, very differently, and the Palestinian Authority is dealt with very, very differently. And there's a partnership, not a warm partnership, but there's a partnership for security, for safety, for those sorts of things so that people can live together. That is very different even than the Arabs who live in Israel. And after being polled, after October 7th, and even before that, greater than 70% of the Arabs who live, the Palestinians who live in the state of Israel, say that they would not want to move or be part of a Palestinian state and would want to stay in Israel because the opportunities and the freedoms are much greater. Right? So the people that live in Israel, look, there is bias and racism in every society. And I have no doubt that Arabs and Jews are not treated equally in the land of Israel. I'm not saying that they are. However, there's no official prohibitions, right? And so we see, I mean, I was just at when we were there, we were at the hospital, Shari Tzedek Hospital, and the doctor who spoke to us was an Arab, was a Muslim Arab. And he was treating all the victims that were coming in from October 7th and all of that. There are Arabs, Muslim Arabs, who serve in the military, in the IDF. There's a great meme that was just going on about two people praying next to each other, one with tefillin and one on a prayer rug. Right? So there are opportunities there. There's bias and there's things like that which we have to deal with in all of our societies. I'm not saying that we don't. But the reality of being an Arab in Israel is very different and much more favorable than being an Arab in any of these quote unquote occupied territories.
Rabbi, it's Neil. You know,
Yeah,
Israel
right.
doesn't do itself any favors. The government, I should say, the government, when they have some, and I'm going to be a little political, some of their far right politicians make statements such as made during the week this week. You know, we have to get all the Arabs out. We have to do away with them, and no Arabs should be in the West. They just make a certain small group make statements that doesn't do any of us any good.
Look, my cringe,
on the roof of your talk.
My cringe factor on when
Yeah.
these guys speak is the same as when, Representative Green was speaking, when she was doing all sorts of stuff, in the last, right? We all have idiots that are part of our government. That's part of being a democracy, right? You pay for freedom with the fact that sometimes there are people who are in power that don't speak for you. And we should speak up against that. And by the way, I mean, on October 6th, Israel was in the process of overturning what this government was going to try to do because it's a democracy with all of the protests, with everything that was going on, right? The judicial reforms that would have taken away a lot of freedoms were pretty much dead in the water. And that's what a democracy is. People got in and they ran, there's an ignorance of the masses, which we have here too, in our great country of the United States. And people get convinced that the only way to be safe is to have Netanyahu and all these people in there. Well, what they found out now is they weren't safe with him either.
You're right. That's a good point. Part of the issue with Israel, they're a parliamentarian democracy, meaning a few small groups have outsized power.
Correct.
In that type of democracy. And that's how it's a little different than American democracy.
Correct. It's got its pluses and minuses, right? Every there's no democratic system that is perfect. They all have their challenges. The parliamentary system that Israel has allows for small parties to have a lot of power because they become kingmakers, right? You need 61 votes to hold the government out of the 120 seats in Knesset, right? It's a simple majority plus one. And when you've got 57 votes and a crazy right-wing party has 4 that they're willing to give to you, what are you going to do? Are you going to not be in government? Or are you going to give in to these crazy people? And that's what happened. That's absolutely what happened. And it created a lot of division in Israel in the same way that Trump's candidacy did and will likely again create division within our country. So yes, that is the price of being in a democracy, is there are people that can say things, they have the freedom to say things that don't reflect you. And the way to deal with that in a democracy is to vote them out. Which I feel that when Israel has another election, once all of this is done, will happen. Right? I think Netanyahu has realized how toxic Ben Gvir and Smotrich are. It's really just Ben Gvir now. Smotrich has kind of gotten quiet. And even the ultra-Orthodox. And I think it'll either be a left-wing government or somewhat of a unity government, at least for the time being until things heal. But nothing's going to happen until this war is over. Any other questions? All right, well, next week, we will try to answer the question, what can we do? And it's not an easy question. And I will preface already by saying, I don't have the silver bullet or the panacea or whatever metaphor you want to use to say, this is what we can do and everything will be hunky-dory, right? We're dealing with this on a lot of different places. And so I'll bring some of the materials that we learned at the Antisemitism Symposium. I'm actually dealing with the schools a lot right now. I'm going to talk to you about what's going on there and what I've been dealing with at Torrey Pines, at CCA, and now at middle school in Poway School District, and how we're sort of helping them deal with stuff. There's ways to respond. There's ways to combat this without either devolving down to their level or throwing up our hands and saying there's nothing that we can do. All right. Have a great week. Stay
Thank
dry.
you very much.
Avoid
Thank you.
tornadoes.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you.